Nisabula, Bozu, bienvenue, welcome. I'm Dr. Milavaha and I'm your MC for today. On behalf of the School of Government Development and International Affairs, I would like to welcome you for this event that we are organizing here tonight together with the representation of the government of New Caledonia. Few housekeeping matters. Bathrooms can be found just outside the door, and also our reception area is there afterwards. Programs can be found on the side table if you wish to follow it. But without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Paul Ahluwalia, Vice Chancellor and the President of the University of South Pacific, to welcome you all for this event.
Isambula, namaste, warm Pacific greetings, everybody. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to welcome all of you here this afternoon. Your Excellency, Dame Meg Taylor, and Your Excellency Amina Uvoli, the roving ambassador for Fiji, distinguished members of our panel, Ms. Denise Fisher, the Reverend James Bhagwan, and of course, Nick McClellan, who I can see also on the screen. Members of the Diplomatic Corps, distinguished guests, members of our staff and students, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to you all. It's my absolute pleasure and privilege on behalf of the University of the South Pacific to welcome you all here this afternoon to discuss the role of regional and sub-regional actors in New Caledonia's second referendum on independence. USP is extremely proud to partner with the representative of the government of New Caledonia in Fiji to provide space for this important debate. The Pacific Island countries share not only a geographical region, but also colonial history, albeit in this case, French colonial history. And countries in the region have only recently become independent, with countries like Fiji shortly celebrating its 50th anniversary, and Vanuatu, which recently in July celebrated its 40th anniversary. Some of you might know that my area of academic specialty is post-colonial studies. So I'm particularly interested in this transition of societies from the colonial to the post-colonial. Although for me, the colonial never leaves. It's not like there is a colonial and an after colonialism. So post-colonialism doesn't mean after colonialism, but rather how the colonial continues to impact on the post-colonial and how its cultures are so enmeshed that you can't get away from the colonial period. I think the current referendum in New Caledonia is really a continuum of a series of agreements ending civil conflict in the 1980s, and it's supported by the United Nations, as well as the Pacific Island countries, encouraging that decolonization project. And of course, again, decolonization is, as I said, it's not just after colonization, but it's also about decolonizing the mind, which I think is such a big part of this process. In 1986, the Pacific Island states successfully secured unanimous support in the UN General Assembly over France's opposition and abstention to relisting New Caledonia as a non-self-governing territory, subject to UN Decolonization Committee oversight. And of course, the Nemiro Accord, almost 12 years later, provided for a referendum on self-determination for New Caledonia and the transfer of certain powers from France to New Caledonia. That first referendum happened nearly 2 years ago, where the majority of New Caledonians voted for status quo to remain under the French Republic. And the Nemiro Accord provides for up to 3 votes in the event of a no vote in the referendum on self-determination. So both the UN and the Pacific Islands Forum had observed the first referendum, and a referendum provides for people's participation in decision over their self-determination, and it gives New Caledonians a voice to express their preference. So the question, I mean, this is in a different context. The question is not very different from the kind of questions that South Africans faced. South Africans who had been there for generations, and not just, you know, who were not seen to be just visitors, but rather who were deeply enmeshed within the history of those societies. I want to reassure everybody that, of course, USP is a strong supporter of good governance, and as the Premier tertiary education provider in our region. We very much encourage these kinds of discussions. We encourage that level of connectivity with the region. We want to make sure that people get an opinion, get their opportunity to voice an opinion about something so fundamental to our region. So on behalf of the university community, I extend you all a very warm welcome and believe that this discussion today will be not only empowering and insightful for our roles, but also very much part of where we see ourselves in the university, that we want to see more democracy prevail and transparent processes embraced throughout the region. So thank you again. I hope you have a great discussion. I have to apologize. I have another meeting at 4:30, so I can only stay till 4:30, but you know that I would rather be here listening to what I am confident is going to be a very exciting afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ahluwalia. And next in our program is a historical overview of the case that we're going to be discussed today. And that's going to be delivered to us by Ms. Denise Fisher. She's a former senior Australian diplomat and has served as Australian Consul General in Nouméa in years 2001-2004. She has ever since written extensively, especially on France in the South Pacific, including her 2013 book, France in the South Pacific, Power and Politics. She's currently a visiting Europa Fellow at the ANU Centre for European Studies in Canberra. And as you can see, she will join us via Zoom tonight. Welcome, Denise.
Thank you very much. Well, Vice Chancellor Ahluwalia, Your Excellencies, Dame Meg Taylor, and the ambassadors, Pastor James Bhagwan, my friend and colleague Nick McClellan, and congratulations to Nick as winning the Sean Dorney grant earlier this year, Rose Wete, Delegate for New Caledonia, and Sandra Tart. Thank you all for this kind invitation and opportunity to open this important discussion about this historic second step in this self-determination process in New Caledonia. I've been asked to set the historical background, and I'd like to do that by considering where we are right now, where we came from, before setting a path perhaps for discussion about the future. In New Caledonia, I think we're at a point now which shows just what is possible in this Pacific region after years of turmoil and concern. The 4th of October is the second, as the professor said, of a 4-part process of self-determination, which has been long promised and long awaited. In their wisdom, independence leaders and pro-France counterparts negotiated up to these 3 votes, 2 years apart, from 2018 to 2022, so long as the answer is no to independence. Wouldn't the Brexiteers have liked to have had a chance to have a second and a third vote after that Brexit vote? How smart, how intelligent to plan for this process. The first vote, 56.7% of voters that's favouring staying with France. A very large minority, 43.3%, the vast majority Indigenous Kanaks supporting independence. If this time the vote favours independence, New Caledonia will become independent, but if not, we may have a further vote in 2 years' time. If the answer remains no, then we get the 4th step in this process, discussion about the future governance for New Caledonia. No other self-determination process resembles this one, although Bougainville borrowed elements of it when it voted last year in favour of independence, but that vote was non-binding. New Caledonia's is. But then the situation in New Caledonia is as unique as it is complex, engaging broad regional interests. So it's worth reviewing, how did we get to this historic momentous point? From a personal perspective, I first came to the issues surrounding New Caledonia as a young 23-year-old diplomat. And I was based in the UN political area of our department on one of the rotations you do in your first year. My job was to monitor the UN handling of Kanak demands for independence at the time. Now, I had studied French language and literature at university, and I admit I was absolutely shocked by what I was seeing, what I was reading and analysing. The France of the Pacific at that time did not fit with what I had learned about the respect for freedom, equality and fraternity in the larger story of what France is. I subsequently served mainly in post-colonial places, Africa, the subcontinent, Southeast Asia, and in Washington, DC, which you could argue, I think the Vice-Chancellor would agree, is still post-colonial. And I learned a lot there about France's pivotal role during the American Revolution at the time, which suited more what I understood about France up to that point. When years later I arrived in Nemiro in 2001 to head our diplomatic mission there, I was privileged to see the first mandate in action of the 1998 Nemiro Accord. It was in full swing. It was absolutely normal everywhere to see the loyalist president, who was very tall, Pierre Frogier, with the diminutive vice president, Kanak former freedom fighter Dewe Gorode. Side by side, everywhere they were together. And even the cartoonists used to lampoon them, and it was a figure of great discussion. But to me, it was a highly symbolic and poignant evidence of the hopes and aspirations of the Nemiro Accord. I had the privilege of meeting and getting to know Marie-Claude Chibal, widow of the great freedom fighter Jean-Marie, the champion of Kanak hopes, as well as Jacques Lafleur, still in charge then of a united party, at least at the outset of my posting. By the time I left Foreign Affairs a few years later, it was Marie-Claude who inspired me to turn my attention to developments in the Pacific and New Caledonia, when she visited Canberra to launch the English translation of her husband's writings. Her ongoing quiet presence in New Caledonia was a powerful reminder of the deep compromises made by her husband, Jean-Marie, assassinated just a year after signing them. I'll not forget the evening when Marie-Claude, at a cocktail party, quietly pulled me aside and told me about the reconciliation rites her family had concluded with the family of the assassin in 2003. Equally influential for me were the words of Jacques Lafleur later when I visited New Caledonia again, and he underlined for me how difficult it had been for him, returning from Paris, having signed the historic Matignon Agreement in 1988, to secure and retain the ongoing support of his followers. Indeed, by the end of my posting, he had lost much of his support. The loyalist side of politics split from the one party it had been up to that point for decades under his leadership. He told me that he felt acute concern that the lessons of the 1970s and 80s would be forgotten as the Nemiro Accord came to its end, with all the risks of a return to the violence that that could entail. Reviewing New Caledonia's contemporary history leading to the agreements helps explain these concerns. The earliest moves for greater autonomy in 1932 developed from local Caldoche or European New Caledonians. The first and predominant local political party, the Union Caledonienne, which exists today, back then was formed in 1953 under the banner "Two colours, one united people." This situation sadly was to change as subsequent French administrations rolled back local autonomy from 1963 onwards to control the production of New Caledonia's nickel resource in part, and to preserve its sovereignty for broader strategic reasons related to its nuclear bombing in the South Pacific. The independence movement developed as young Indigenous Kanaks, including those returning from studies in France in the late 1960s, sought to focus increasingly on the Melanesian identity. As France continued to alter statutory provisions relating to the territory, independence leaders became more frustrated and their demands for independence sharpened. They boycotted a self-determination vote in 1987. Why? Because the vote included relative newcomers who'd only been resident in the territory 3 years after a decade of avowed policy by the French to bring in people to the territory to outnumber them. Tension and even violence mounted, culminating, as we know, in the 1988 Gassana Cave hostage situation, which resulted in the deaths of 21 people. It was only after this violent event that leaders came together in Paris for difficult that resulted in that famous handshake between Jacques Lafleur and Jean-Marie Chibal, and the signature of the 1988 Matignon Accord promised an independence vote by 1999. The fragility of that agreement was evident in the assassination of Chibal by an independence supporter a year later for having signed it. By 1998, Jacques Lafleur had raised concerns that it was too early to proceed to the promised vote, the vote that was promised in 1998, because there was such of a risk of return to violence. And independence leaders shared that concern. both sides agreed to a further 20-year deferral in the 1998 Nemiro Accord on the basis of a number of promised handovers, as the Vice-Chancellor said, of responsibility before then to a new local elected Congress and provincial assemblies. Underlining these agreements were efforts to rebalance the economic benefits of the major nickel resource with the construction of major processing plants in the South Nemiro and in the mainly Kanak North. There's no doubt that the wider region played a big role in shaping France's more constructive approach in New Caledonia and in the region. France's policies of nuclear testing in French Polynesia meant that its regional presence had acquired a strategic importance, leading to tighter assertion of sovereignty in its management of independence demands, not only in French Polynesia, but in New Caledonia, lest a demonstration effect take hold and threaten the nuclear program. Neighbouring islands began to show their concern, including through organisations such as the Pacific Council of Churches, and to lend support for their Indigenous brothers and sisters in New Caledonia and French Polynesia. Banned by France from raising these concerns in the then South Pacific Commission, island neighbours who themselves had acquired or were acquiring independence formed the South Pacific Forum in 1971, which was to become, as we know, the Pacific Island Forum, the preeminent political forum in the region. At the same time, by the mid-1980s, Melanesian leaders, in solidarity with their Kanak brothers and sisters, formed the Melanesian Spearhead Group, which to this day has a role in monitoring the decolonisation process in New Caledonia. While the NSG has broadened its activities into regional economic cooperation, its members has visited New Caledonia during the campaign for the 2018 independence referendum in support of independence leaders. Pacific Island countries led the way for greater international attention on France's regional policies, while engaging France and its territories through their NGOs, Pacific Island Forum. By 1996, France had ceased nuclear testing in French Polynesia. Pacific Island countries succeeded in 1986, as the Vice-Chancellor said, in relisting New Caledonia as a non-self-governing territory with the UN's Committee of Decolonisation, a status which France had rejected, and therefore subjecting that territory and France to UN self-determination principles ultimately reflected in the 1988 and 1998 agreements. While initially France declined to participate or to take on associated responsibilities, with the signature of the Nemiro Accord in 1998 and the insistence of the independence leaders, it belatedly began reporting to the UN as administrative authority. Similarly, Pacific Island countries led the move to reinscribe French Polynesia with the same committee, also over the opposition of France in 2013. To this day, France does not report to the UN as administering authority for French Polynesia. The Pacific Island Forum sent missions to monitor the evolving situation in New Caledonia in 1999, 2001 and 2004, sending their reports to the United Nations. Their Forum Summit communiques have continued to call attention to New Caledonia developments. Both the UN and the Pacific Island Forum sent missions to the first referendum and will do so again this year. Meanwhile, Pacific countries have engaged with France. The Pacific Island Forum welcomed France as a dialogue partner in 1989 and its territories, French Polynesia and New Caledonia, as full members in 2016. Since 1993, Australia and New Zealand and France have cooperated under the France Agreement to share emergency response capacity, fisheries, other marine surveillance with other island countries, and with the US in quadrilateral defence talks. France participates in regular military exercises with Australia, New Zealand, Vanuatu, PNG and Tonga, and contributes modest assistance to the region through its €1 million Pacific Fund, other bilateral activity, and through the SPC, including through the EU, whose engagement in the region France has led. France began regular oceanic summits with the Pacific Island states in 2003. For its part, in recent years, France has directly recognised the strategic importance of its territories in the region, giving it a place at the regional table at a time of shift in great power balances. The 7 million square kilometres of economic zone deriving from its Pacific territories make France number 2 global maritime power, after the US and before Australia, in terms of marine territory. Its string of regional and global territories around the world contribute to its claims as one of only 5 permanent members of the Security Council with veto power, its role in the EU, including in the EU space programme, its NATO membership, its global scientific and technological status, and its status American and Western ally. France shifted its Pacific military headquarters from Papeete to Nemiro in 2008, well after the signature of the Nemiro Accord, I might add, and established a listening post at Nemiro Airport in 2009, making New Caledonia central to its strategic engagement in the region. In May 2018, launching the campaign for the independence referendum, President Emmanuel Macron upped the stakes for France when he identified the French territory of New Caledonia as playing a major role underpinning France's new Indo-Pacific vision, which he described as an arc of influence, stretching from Paris through New Delhi and Canberra to Nemiro and Papeete, provided those places remained French. After the result of the vote was announced, he expressed pride in the vote to stay with France and reiterated the role of New Caledonia in the Indo-Pacific vision. So France wants to continue its constructive engagement in the South Pacific for ever more important strategic reasons. And history shows that it needs the acceptance and support of Pacific Island states to do so. How has France performed in implementing the Nemiro Accord? Well, not a bad job, it has to be said. Many of the promised handovers have been made. There have been 2 major multi-billion-dollar nickel plants constructed, but the successes have not been unmitigated. Economic development has seen varied benefits, with most sides of politics and a UN Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Rights agreeing that by 2018 that many young Kanaks had missed out. Still, all sides finally agreed that it was time to initiate the final stage of the Nemiro Accord, the referendum process, only at the last moment, just before the statutory deadline expired. They couldn't agree before then to do that. France took considerable pains to ensure an uncontested referendum with United Nations and Pacific Island observers, and the achievement of 1% turnout with no subsequent questioning of the result. And this is not an achievement which is not to be underestimated. It is a huge achievement when you consider the history of New Caledonia. It's a huge achievement of France and of the independence leaders and of the pro-France political groups. The 57-43 result was strongly along ethnic lines, with independence supporters correlating highly with Kanak areas. Indeed, the outcome reflects the very disposition of the vote that we've seen between independence and loyalist parties in all local elections since the Nemiro Accord was signed. But what's different this time round? Well, we're going to see a larger cohort of voters. There are about 6,000 eligible 18-year-olds now voting this time on the 4th of October who couldn't vote last time. These voters, together with the 33,000 who abstained last time, will be really courted and being targeted by both sides. It's worth recalling that in 2018, there were only 18,000 votes that separated the noes from the yeses. Since then, we've unsurprisingly seen a polarisation between both sides as they have sought to position themselves. In contrast to the last campaign, the last 2018 campaign, this time we have seen independence leaders highly critical of France. They've questioned the French state's implementation of the COVID strategy, alleging lack of respect for local conditions and local quarantine requirements. They've criticised France's decision to allow the loyalists to use the French flag in their campaigning. And they've accused France of not listening to their own submissions when France released its statutorily required statement of the legal consequences of a yes and a no vote. Independence leaders have also come out strongly against foreign participation in the rescue of the southern nickel plant, saying that they want the nickel plant to be under local control. So where do we go from here? As we've, after an agreed transition period, and the independence leaders have indicated that might be about 3 years. If not, a further vote may be held in 2 years' time, after which discussions must be held about the future governance in the absence of a yes to independence. Well, while all of the institutions that have been created, all of the transfers of responsibility, or at least be renegotiated, which is this part of the process, which I would argue is the most significant, regardless of the outcome of the votes. Elements requiring at least discussion and probably agreement would include retaining or not special voting and employment rights for long-term residents over the newcomers who continue to come in from other parts of France, the fate of the 5 core sovereign responsibilities currently with France. Those are things like defence and foreign affairs, international status, including UN membership, specific powers, such as tertiary education and the broadcast media, which legally can be transferred, but for which the parties could not agree up till now, management across the territory of the nickel resource, and formulas for political representation and financial allocations. The central issue of control of immigration and opportunities for Kanak youth. Every one of these issues touch on the most fundamental grievances and concerns of Indigenous Kanak people, the vast majority of whom voted for independence in 2018 and who may do so twice more by 2022. What can the wider region do as these momentous developments unfold? As in the past, Pacific Island Forum and MSG leaders and relevant NGOs are concerned to ensure the full and fair implementation of commitments by all parties. The importance of their ongoing role and interest cannot be minimised. PIF continued involvement in observer missions and as links with the UN will be important. As I see it, our forum leaders want constructive partnerships based on reciprocal interests, and we would all like to see France and the French Pacific territories more engaged in the day-to-day working life of the region, beyond existing defence and cooperation links, with stronger involvement in mutually productive regional trade and economic relationships, including around minerals, tourism, fisheries, cultural and educational, scientific and sporting exchanges, and fulfilling shared goals of sustainable development and managing climate change. Specifically, it is reasonable for all of us to expect France to assist in a practical way in early, more open market access for Pacific Island economies to French territory and European markets than in the past, as we see the phasing out of ACP preferences and the Cotonou Agreement. The region now has more choices for productive partnerships than in the past, as China and other countries are seeking influence. And it will be up to France and its regional territories to make significant gestures for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. I would now like to invite the head of School of Government, Dr. Sandra Tart, to introduce our panelists who can come forward, please.
Sorry. Could I invite our distinguished panelists to please come forward? Dame Meg, would you like to sit here? Excellency, yeah, there, James. Thank you. Good afternoon. As mentioned earlier, the theme of this panel discussion is the role of regional and sub-regional actors in the New Caledonia referendum process. Each panelist has been invited to reflect on this process from the perspective of their organization or government and drawing on their considerable experience in the region. I'll begin by inviting Dame Meg Taylor, Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum, to make her remarks. I think it's 10 minutes each. Dame Meg? Is that okay? Yep.
Okay. Your Excellencies, and I see ambassadors and high commissioners from our missions here from the Pacific to Fiji and to the Pacific Island Forum. Thank you for being here. And of course, to many of the students and academics within the USP, thank you for including me in this discussion. Let me just get straight to the point. And the main thing here is that many of you know that New Caledonia, who was an associate member of the Pacific Island Forum since 2006, and before that as an observer, then became a member of the Pacific Island Forum in 2016. That was very much an interesting move that territories were then given full membership of the Pacific Island Forum. But that's another debate. The important issue here is that the Forum's support for New Caledonia in its journey to self-determination has spanned a period of close to 40 years. And New Caledonia's self-determination aspirations were first recognised when leaders met in Rotorua in 1982, and notably then progressed the agenda for New Caledonia through the 1983 Forum in Canberra. And this was very important for New Caledonia because it was including and recognising Kanak legitimacy and their inherent active right to self-determination and independence. So I think we have something to be very proud of in the Pacific, is that our leaders have been closely involved in this movement for a very long time. So leaders also urged France to continue to carry out its responsibility in guaranteeing New Caledonia's independence in a peaceful manner and through instituting time-bound and transitional autonomy powers, and call for a forum mission to the territory. So since the early 80s, the Forum has actively participated in supporting the people of New Caledonia to practice their rights to self-determination. As you heard earlier, in 1986, Forum members at the United Nations successfully mobilized support for the reinscription of New Caledonia on the UN list of non-self-governing territories, subject to decolonization. And that's a big step. But you've also heard that France does not report back to the United Nations on anything that is happening within New Caledonia. So following the violence that erupted in 1988 and the subsequent signature of the Maritime Accord, Forum leaders established the Forum Ministerial Committee to New Caledonia in 1990 to observe and report on the progress made in the implementation of the Accords. So the mandate of the Ministerial Committee was later expanded to include the implementation of the Nemiro Accord in 1998. So since then, the Ministerial Committee has undertaken 9 visits to New Caledonia between July 1991 and November 2018. In general, the Ministerial Committee is pleased with the implementation of the Accords. And on its mission in 2013, the committee was impressed by the overwhelming political will shown by all stakeholders. It met with to ensuring continued peace, stability and prosperity for New Caledonia. And the committee also recognised the significant progress and benefits brought under the Nemiro Accord, particularly on the social and economic rebalancing undertaken across New Caledonia's provinces. For a long time, the distribution of wealth, the distribution of benefits was very much focused in the south and not in other parts of New Caledonia, and that has been progressed. The recognition of Kanak identity was very important, and the establishment of national institutions and the devolution of administrative power, the functions from France to New Caledonia. I thought I was going to be standing there, and I don't know this all off by heart, I'm sorry. The implementation of the Nemiro Accord has, however, not been without its difficulties and challenges, and the reality of persistent socio-economic issues remain in New Caledonia. It is reported that New Caledonia's prisons are overrepresented by Kanak youth and low representation in middle management and senior positions. In the private and public sector, despite significant advances in the education sector, but we nevertheless acknowledge that the rebalancing in progress that will take some time, and that a reduction in development gaps has been clear in the last 20 years. But I wanted to raise one thing with you, and that is that furthermore, that in New Caledonia's journey to self-determination, there's been a real serious participation of women. And the law in 2000 and the 2000 election parity law requiring an equal number of male and female candidates in national elections has led to a fundamental shift in New Caledonia's political landscape. And the rest of the Pacific could really learn from that. And I think countries like Fiji have really made a big effort on that. But in some of our countries, are no women in the parliaments. But in New Caledonia, there's been a big shift on that. There's also been another important feature in economic rebalancing required by the Nemiro Accord, and that is evident from the Kaniambo nickel smelter mine in the north. This has really meant that Indigenous landowners have ownership, so therefore their equity in this economic activity, and that has meant that it has brought jobs and greater prosperity to those communities. Let me turn to 2018. The Ministerial Committee hang on, sorry. This is not the way to do it. My apologies. Let me just turn now to the visit, the last 2018 referendum. I was privileged to be on that team, on that mission that went there. The Ministerial Committee was comprised of ministers from Nauru, Vanuatu, and also electoral representative from Samoa. And in general, the Ministerial Committee was happy with the arrangements made for the referendum, but the conclusion was that the 2018 referendum, whilst it was transparent, credible, and considered free and fair, what the main concern was that there was a serious lack of understanding in the electorate. Now, my colleague Alafileti Soka and I, we were in one of the outer islands in Lifu, and it was clear there that when we met with many communities, we visited nearly every polling station that there was, people did not really understand what it meant to vote yes and what it meant to vote no, and what the consequences of voting yes for independence meant. And I think that that was a real disservice to the people. And I'm aware that there are appropriate education campaigns that are going on now. So in the next weeks, there will be the next referendum. And what does that mean for the Pacific Island Forum and for the Ministerial Committee? So with the COVID, what's happened is that the logistics are going to be very difficult for us because we can't get there for a start. And usually every mission is led by ministers, accompanied by officials. And this means that we're going to rely very much on any of our member states of the forum that have missions in Nemiro that can take a lead in this for us. But it will mean that we won't get the kind of information that we had hoped to. In summing up, I just want to say that self-determination in the Pacific for some of our countries has meant real hard fights. For others, it has been tumultuous in its history, but it's also been difficult and protracted, as it is, I believe, in New Caledonia. It's not easy. I think that the voting patterns that have been there in the past, particularly when votes have been stacked by people coming in from France, which has now been legislated against so that it's much broader representation. There are still splits and different points of view within the community that it should be only Canucks that vote and nobody else. However, there's been a great effort under the Nemiro Accord to bring everybody together, that all stakeholders have a voice in this and participate in the voting. But to ask people to vote yes or no is not as simple as we all think as it is on posters. I think what we've noticed most of all is that when we visited a school outside of Nemiro is the self-identity, the identity of young people, that they are New Caledonians and that they are Pacific Islanders. This was apparent when, particularly in the past, where people were just not so sure where they all fitted into the land, to the seascape of the Pacific. I'll leave it at there, and we wish that, that the people of New Caledonia have the opportunity to define their future.
Thank you very much, Dame Meg Taylor, Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum. Our second speaker on the panel this afternoon is His Excellency Mr. Amena Yaovoli, who is the Head of Mission Designate to the Fiji Embassy in Washington and also Roving Ambassador in the Roving Ambassador Division Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Fiji. He was also, until recently, the Director General of the Melanesian Spearhead Group. Amen.
Thank you, Sandra. With all protocols observed, let me just dive straight into the issue at hand, the discussions at hand. I'm speaking specifically based on my experience as the immediate past Director General of the Melanesian Spearhead Group, of which Fiji is also a member. And I would like to, my first point would like to emphasize at this stage is that MSG was created for the liberation of New Caledonia. That is a mandate that leaders gave to the organization when they birthed the organization in Goroka, Papua New Guinea in 1986, 2 years before the Matignon Accord was signed. So you could see that our MSG leaders were already active in the sub-region, promoting and advocating for the issues of New Caledonia, of the Kanaks, supporting their liberation, particularly through the membership of the FLNKS into the MSG. So I would like to make that point very clear. It is a mandate of the leaders that enable the organization, that drive the organization to support. It's not a partial mandate, it's a full mandate by leaders. So you can see that the organization is fully mandated to support the FLNKS achieve their political aspirations through the outline process, through the Matignon Accord and the New Accord. We participated not as observers like Meg was mentioning earlier, but supporting the FLNKS, the political bureau. The political mandate that we were given is to support the political bureau of the FLNKS in outlining, in providing the necessary political advice, as well as technical assistance that can enable them to work hard and achieve their status, the political aspirations that they are aiming for. In 2007, 2008, the MSG Secretariat was opened, and it sort of, this mandate became an expression of the work program of the Secretariat to support the work, the visible support that leaders have in terms of supporting the FLNKS. And it is heartening to note that it expresses the wishes of leaders to continue to support the FLNKS achieving their objectives. So in recent years, prior to my departure back to Fiji, there's been lots of activities that the Secretariat was involved in at the political level to support the FLNKS. This was mostly in the areas of global advocacy, that's one, and in promoting the issues for the pro-independence people of New Caledonia. And also to say that the consistent support that we provide through the Special Committee on Decolonization, the C24 in New York, this continued to be an ongoing agenda for the last 4 years, for the last 3 years, prior to 2018, and also last year before COVID. The organization has been very much instrumental in advocating for the support towards the FLNKS in achieving their political aspirations, and which is to liberate New Caledonia. And some of the activities that we were participating in was mostly in the areas of attending the opening session of the C24 in New York in June 2018. That became very important for us because issues such as the electoral list, eligibility of voters, economic and social status of Kanaki people, capacity development needs, institutional development, and racial discrimination were the core issues that we tabled. Through the strong leadership of the Papua New Guinea mission in New York and all MSG ambassadors, they took these issues to the C24. And it became apparent that that these are real issues that needs to be addressed. At the same time, there was the NEM session, the non-aligned movement meeting in Azerbaijan. MSG and some of our leaders attended that meeting with the aim to advocate and strongly support the issues that FLNKS are asking us to do. In Continuing on to the technical assistance at the regional level, there's been a support from the New Caledonia Congress, request from New Caledonia Congress to continue to reach out to various countries in the Pacific, particularly in Melanesia, who can support the work that the Congress are doing to strengthen their aims of their political aspirations. And it's something which is not easy because politics always drive the wedge within the MSG memberships. And it's always been difficult for the Secretariat to try and coherently provide our support when we see that there is some sort of difficulties in moving this particular agenda forward. Even though the leaders have made it very clear that this is a core mandate of the organization. So the other aspect is the representing the FLNKS in attending seminars organized by the UN, decolonization seminars, particularly in the Caribbean or in other parts of the UN member states. That we normally attend that to represent the issues for the FLNKS. So it's gone a long way for us and for the MSG Secretariat and for the MSG as a body to move this political agenda forward. And it is our hope that it will continue, the solidarity will remain in the group to continue to elevate, particularly in preparations for the second referendum that is coming up next month. Beyond that is something that the organization is eager to do. And Fiji, being a member of the MSG, is fully behind the commitment of leaders to support them in their political aspirations. So we hope that even though that we cannot be able to attend in person in New Caledonia, perhaps there could be some innovative ways identified on how we can be able to support our group, which is the FLNKS, as a member of the Melanesian Spearhead Group. I'll stop there, Sandra, and we'll wait for questions thereafter. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Yavoli. Our third speaker on the panel this afternoon is Reverend James Bhagwan, who is the General Secretary of the Pacific Conference of Churches, which is the peak regional ecumenical body in the Pacific. James.
Thank you, Sandra, Secretary General, members of the Diplomatic Corps and friends. Also to our two friends on Zoom, Nick sitting patiently there. Greetings and happy International Peace Day on behalf of the Pacific Conference of Churches. PCC is made up of 31 mainline churches, as well as 9 national councils of churches, which stretch from West Papua in the Western Pacific to the Marshall Islands in the north, out there in New Zealand in the south, and Maui Nui, also known as French Polynesia, in the east. This accounts for about 80% of the Pacific population. For the last 6 decades of its existence, PCC has been at the forefront of social, economic, and political issues, from independence movements, addressing nuclear testing, structural inequality, Pacific regionalism, climate change, and rethinking development issues. The first PCC conference took place in 1961 in Lufu, New Caledonia. The next PCC General Assembly will also be taking place in possibly Lufu, New Caledonia. And as we commemorate International Day of Peace, I would like to begin my intervention as PCC and on behalf of our member church, the Église Protestante de Kanaki Nouvelle-Calédonie, by saying that there can be no real peace without justice. On August the 31st, 1979, the then Evangelical Church in New Caledonia and the Loyalty Islands issued a declaration which stated the following: in the multicultural country that is Kanaki New Caledonia, where the Kanaks have become a minority at home, people exiled in their own lands, the church reports that only the Kanak people colonized can claim their independence from international rights. The Kanak people who claim their dignity must respect the dignity of other ethnic groups in New Caledonia. And supporting the oppressed is the requirement of the gospel. This statement, issued in 1979, was reaffirmed just a few weeks ago at the enlarged Executive Council of the EPKNC meeting in Nemiro on the August 16th to 19th. And so as the PCC, we continue to affirm and support the stand of our member church, who are concerned that the liberation of Kanak people is still stifled because of the non-Kanak population and other communities, particularly from France, that represent a majority in the demographic mass. We affirm the call by the EPKNC for the continued implementation of the Nemiro Accord as the only way to achieve the integrity, cultural and political and social unity of a people still under French domination. Such an ethnic instrumentalization remains a phenomenon of polarization in Kanak soil. There is still a balance of power in the territory which is unfavorable to the Kanak people, to their legal interests, to the interests which come from their right, their natural right, and their character as indigenous people. The Kanak term for authentic human, dokamo, does not reside only in the ebony-skinned body of a Melanesian, but is expressed in every human being, whether European, Polynesian, Micronesian, or elsewhere. In its mission, the Church in Kanaki has initiated theological reflections on several themes, such as to walk together, fellow citizens of a new country, family and the gospel in a changing society. And these themes and these reflections are done in order to accompany the people of God in their search for emancipation, where in a colonial context, the colonizer takes up the challenge of emancipating themselves in order to create a new country with transformed inhabitants in order to attain the perfect stature of Christ, the central post of their new country. And so this Kanak notion of dokamo, the authentic human, is capital, because in seeking this man and this woman who finds in their dignity the fullness of Christ, seeks the prospect of living free, responsible, and united multicultural citizenship, where they take on the challenge of their environment and the challenges of the world. The EPKNC is convinced that it is possible to settle the colonial dispute through the reciprocal recognition of the other, of their dignity. And this goes through the paths of forgiveness, reconciliation, repatriation for injustices committed, for the liberation of victims of colonial history. The people of Melanesia are generally happy and accommodating, and they welcome visitors with open arms. We have enough food and land to share, and we do so willingly. Is it not too much to ask that we be allowed to achieve independence in dignity and continue to live alongside you in peace and mutual prosperity? The Protestant Church of Kanaki, New Caledonia, calls on its members and the Caledonian people to take an act of faith in the individual choice that they will make on October 4. The Church remains confident in the ability of politicians to turn the result of the October 4 referendum into a win-win attempt. The Church respects their choice and seeks to create links between opposing groups. Whether it is yes or no, they believe that they must end up with a dynamic solution which invites each to live with the other. As a family of churches in the Pacific, the PCC and its members stand with the EPKNC to build bridges between groups, whatever the outcome of the referendum, in the hope that they will bring about true and lasting peace. It's important to us that all members of our family work together, because we cannot truly be free until all Pacific Islanders taste the sweetness of liberty. All Pacific Islanders, heir to 1,000-year-old civilization and called upon in its mission to announce the gospel, will announce this good news in a globalized world. Are we not called upon to form that authentic humanity, the do kamo. Man or woman emancipated according to Christ, responsible, free, and united to bring their part of humanity to the world, to exchange and live in new relationships of interdependence, where everyone is responsible at home and in communion with all others, to safeguard the divine creation and live the peace of God in fraternity, here and now as elsewhere, and to continue the great commission of our Lord to make disciples of all nations. And for those of you gathered here, may I ask you that whatever your political or religious persuasion may be, you join our PCC churches this Sunday, 27th September, and on Referendum Day, 4th October, to pray for peace, understanding, and tolerance as Kanaki votes. Manaka.
Thank you very much, Reverend James Bhagwan. Our fourth and final panelist this afternoon is Mr. Nick McClellan. Nick works as a journalist and researcher in the Pacific Islands. He is a correspondent for Islands Business magazine and other regional media, and he has reported widely and for many decades on French policy in the Pacific. Nick is also the author and co-author of several books on France in the Pacific, including After Moroa, France in the South Pacific. And he was recently awarded the 2020 Sean Dorney Grant for Pacific Journalism by the Walkley Foundation. Nick is speaking to us from Melbourne, Victoria. I might invite our panelists, maybe would you like to go down to the front and listen to this? Over to you, Nick.
Thank you very much to Professor Tart, to Professor Tart, to Rose Wette of the Government of New Caledonia. Thank you for the invitation to participate today. I speak from a distance in Melbourne, Australia. I probably wouldn't be with you today because as a journalist, I would be in Nemiro reporting on the referendum campaign. In 2018, I spent a month there going to talk to people across the political spectrum about their hopes and aspirations for the future. Today I want to touch on the broader regional context and make just a few comments about the significance, because I want to put to you that this referendum on the 4th of October is not simply a replay of the vote held on the 4th of November 2018. In terms of the regional context, I acknowledge the previous speakers, Dame Meg Taylor, Ambassador Yavoli, Denise Fisher, Reverend Bhagwan. Denise showed the sweep, the tensions that existed in the 1980s and 1990s over nuclear testing, 30 years of nuclear tests, the militarization of New Caledonia in the 1980s, the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior. Those days are long gone, and France is a much more active partner in the Pacific Islands region, a key aid partner. It's leveraged its role particularly also through the European Union. And I think one of the dominant features of recent years is that together with Germany, France is a major player within the European Union, and the EU has sought to build close links with smaller island developing states, particularly in the Pacific. You've seen that during climate negotiations under the aptly named Paris Agreement on climate change. You've seen it where with the withdrawal of the United Kingdom from the EU under Brexit, France has taken a much more active role, as they say, the only European Union member state that has territory in the Pacific. And those of you in Suva will know that France's former ambassador to Fiji now represents the European Union delegation to the Pacific. And so France has quite actively leveraged its role as a climate ally, sometimes not very subtly pointing the finger at Canberra and Washington, who very clearly are acting against the interests of small island developing states when it comes to action on fossil fuels, funding for the Green Climate Fund, and other areas. The other key feature, and it's been long building, but I think it's particularly amplified in the last few years, even since the 2018 referendum, is the strategic alliance between the ANZUS allies, Australia, New Zealand and the United States, and other Western and non-Western allies to promote the containment of China. The growing tensions between the United States and China are played out with attempts to build alliances and partnerships in the region against perceived Chinese influence. That's particularly true in Australia, that over the last decade or more has negotiated and signed a series of strategic partnership agreements between Australia and France. In 2018, when French President Emmanuel Macron visited Australia and New Caledonia, he signed a new vision statement linking Australia and France. Some of that is driven by arms sales. Australia currently is about to spend $89 billion in coming years on the purchase of French-built submarines for the Australian Defence Force. It's tied to this broader global geopolitical tensions, though, where Australia very clearly sees France, Britain to a certain extent, India, as allies in the Asia-Pacific contest that we see underway today. And when Macron visited Sydney, standing on the deck of an Australian warship, he gave a keynote speech and talked about an Indo-Pacific axis that linked India, Australia and France, and the argument that France should maintain its colonial possessions in the Indian and Pacific Oceans as part of that broader alliance. We've seen since 2018 growing collaboration in this area. Just the other day, I interviewed Australia's Consul General in Nemiro, Alison Carrington, and she made a clear statement, which I'd like to quote, stating that there's an alignment between Australia's step-up engagement with the Pacific and France's Indo-Pacific Axis strategy. Both of us see ourselves committed to security in the region and meeting the security needs of the region. In that sense, France is a very important partner for Australia. This raises a whole series of questions about, obviously, the definition of security for peoples in the Pacific, and particularly colonized peoples in the Pacific, given in Guam, in French Polynesia, in New Caledonia, and so on. There are still colonized peoples under the administration of the United Nations Special Committee on Decolonization. That question of that broader geopolitical tension with Western allies and India, Japan to a certain extent, seeing France as an ally in the Indo-Pacific region comes, I think, and overlays the domestic struggle going on within New Caledonia between supporters and opponents of independence. And that's a very important part of the context. I think it poses challenges for Pacific Islands nations that are also building very strong partnerships with France as a key player in the region. And I think that's an important part of the context facing movements like the Kanak Socialist National Liberation Front. Just to finish my comments, I think it's important, as I said, to see what happens in October, not simply as a replay of 2018. And I'll just flag a few things quickly that people may want to discuss further. The first is that people know the result of what happened last time. One of the features of the 2018 referendum, and both Denise Fisher and myself have written about this in the Journal of Pacific History when we reviewed the last referendum, the polling got it very wrong. And senior French politicians told me on the record that they thought the result would be somewhere around 70-30, 70% of people voting no to stay within the French Republic, only 30% or less voting yes for independence. That polling and the pundits were largely wrong, and as has been said, the vote for independence was 43.3% in favour of independence. Not a majority, obviously, but close enough to 50% to encourage the independence movement and certainly dishearten partisans of the French Republic. And what we've seen since that time over the last nearly 2 years has been some reconfiguration of politics in New Caledonia. The 2019 elections for New Caledonia's Provincial Assembly and Congress saw a significant defeat for the dominant anti-independence party, Caledonia Ensemble, that's New Caledonia Together, led by Philippe Gomez. Their representation in the Congress was halved, with conservative voters a bit shocked, I'd argue, by the referendum result, punishing the dominant force. A new coalition of conservative anti-independence parties was formed, Avenir en Confiance, and today that group of three major anti-independence parties has forged links with three smaller parties, including the extreme right-wing National Front, or Rassemblement National as it's now known. So this loyalist alliance has come together, 6 parties opposed to independence, very actively campaigning for a no vote amongst people who didn't bother to vote in 2018. Some 33,000 people didn't vote last time, even though they were eligible to vote for that shift. On the independent side, some of the smaller parties, the Labour Party, Parti Travailliste, and the Kanak Trade Union Confederation, USTKE, both called for non-participation last time in 2018, believing that only the colonised Kanak people should vote. This time, both those two smaller groups have forged a new front and are actively campaigning for a yes vote. And that could pick up small pockets of people who didn't vote last time, particularly in the Loyalty Islands and in the north of the country. A third new force is a Wallisian party known as Éveil Océanien, the Pacific Awakening. This group was only formed after the referendum. Only in March 2019 did it come into office. They won 3 seats in the Congress in the 2019 elections and hold the balance of power between supporters and opponents of independence, which they've leveraged to gain votes and positions in the Congress, in the national government, and in other positions in the Southern Province. What's striking that this party, which gains its support from particularly the Wallisian and Futunan communities, some Tahitians, these are islanders, Polynesian islanders who have lived, often been born in New Caledonia. They've directly targeted that community, which makes up a significant proportion, 11 or 12% of the electorate. And they've said that they've encouraged people to vote, but have said it's up to you to decide whether you vote yes or no. And this is quite significant because historically, the Wallisian and Futunan communities have voted no, have always supported anti-independence parties, believing that their future lies with the European community, which dominates those anti-independent parties. This is a change that I think was flagged by Dame Meg, that a younger generation of people want to transcend some of the historic cleavages between communities in New Caledonia, between communities in the Pacific, trying to build a common destiny, to use the jargon that's often used, and believe that they need to think about the concerns that directly affect people around housing, around education, around employment, around their hopes for the future. This doesn't mean that there'll be a majority necessarily supporting independence of on the vote on the 4th of October, but both sides, supporters and opponents of independence, when I've interviewed people over the last few weeks, have said even a few points beyond 43% would be a significant victory for the FLNKS, given that there is a third referendum. And the leader of the Kanak Party, Parti de Libération Kanak, Paul Neotine, who's president of the Northern Province, interviewed the other day, said, "We will not give up our accession to sovereignty. Regardless of the vote this year and a potential third vote, I think the Kanak quest for independence hasn't died, and a younger generation has taken up the flag for those that were active during the 1980s. And you only have to think of a country like East Timor, where a young generation that grew up under Indonesian occupation was at the forefront of voting for Timor's self-determination in 1999, creating a new nation in the Pacific. Regardless of what happens with this referendum and the next, I think this debate about sovereignty and independence won't go away, and that poses a challenge to the forum the Melanesian Spearhead Group, and indeed all member governments of those organisations, as well as we as citizens of the region. I thank you for the time, the invitation to be with you today. I'm sorry it's at a distance, but I thank you for the opportunity to join this important discussion.
Thank you very much, Nick. Could I invite the three panelists in this room to come forward? And we will now open the floor for the Q&A, which our friends overseas will also be part of. So if you do have questions for Denise or Nick, please feel free to direct those. So the floor is open. There are microphones moving around if you need them. Please, so please raise your hand. So we've got Beth behind. No? No. Okay, sorry. Yes, up the back. Could you please identify yourself as well? Thank you.
Hi, Malalele. My name is Anna Jane, and I am a Tongan student that is currently studying here at the University of the South Pacific. I am one of a number of students that are here, even though you probably cannot see them on the camera. And unfortunately, I am one of many who have just recently found out that such a thing is happening, that New Caledonia actually wants independence, and that that a referendum is going to be approached soon, and that there is much that is needed to be done. And I was just curious, because I'm one of actually many that don't know a lot of what's going on. I was just curious about the youth involvement in these initiatives, and not just really the youth you reach out to and are trying to make aware of what's happening, but rather the youth you are involving in the process. I wonder if there is a team that is helping, if there are committees that involve them. If yes, can we hear a little bit about it? Is there something we can do? Anything that could inspire us to start our own? And if not, do you think there is a possibility or an opportunity for there to be so? Because it is already encouraging to hear that the younger generation is taking up the flag now. But it would be good to know how we can take up the flag where we are. Thank you.
So it's a question about youth involvement?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Seriously, that we're not talking enough about it all here in the Pacific. I think that around 2018 there was a lot of focus on what was going to happen in terms of the referendum. I think COVID has distracted many of our countries, and priorities have really countries have focused on the health issues, etc. I have colleagues here and of course my the co-panelists who are here in Fiji, that if students here want to have some time to delve much more deeply into this issue, we would make staff available from the Secretariat. But I think your question is really about how you link up with youth in New Caledonia. I think language is a big issue for those conversations. I think that people from Vanuatu do have linkages, especially the French speakers. And you see every year plane loads of students going from Vanuatu to be educated in New Caledonia in the French schools, so that those relationships are nurtured, the youth. But I think in terms of the English-speaking part of the Pacific and the French-speaking, you know, hello everybody, that's a result of colonialism. So the languages, we've got to learn languages where we can communicate with each other, whether it's a Bishlama or a Tokpisin or another language in the Pacific. But I know people like Rose, who represents New Caledonia here, she's had to learn English. In the forum itself, the language of the Pacific Island Forum is English, and our leaders have stuck to that. French, you know, the two territories would like us to have French translations, etc., but that's not been made available because of the decision that the leaders had made. But that doesn't mean that young people can't have some way of communicating with each other. It's an enormous issue to give you a direct answer now. But I think the first thing is really for us to help you understand what the issues are in terms of self-determination across the Pacific and what happened in other countries, particularly close to New Caledonia, the Melanesian countries, and as you know, the emergence of the MSG, the independence of Vanuatu, etc., that would help to inform you of what is happening in New Caledonia. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. Youth involvement through the MSG Secretariat is working through the FLNKS to try and encourage youths, Kanak youths, to participate in the process. You'll see prior to the first referendum, it was a huge challenge working with the youths of New Caledonia, of the Kanaks in particular, because as you know, there's so many factors that really made this work very, very difficult. But we know that we've been working with the FLNKS, and as Meg mentioned, language is a barrier in the first place. For us, we always want to ensure that our youths in Melanesia also participate with some appropriate understanding of the language. And Vanuatu, for that matter, is very fortunate because of their bilingual status of that country. They both speak, they speak 3 languages, or 4, Bislama, French, and English. So it is an aspect that is of concern. And I know that going to the October referendum, I know in discussions with the senior officials of the FLNKS, they told me prior to my departure that this is an aspect that they would like to target in order to narrow, you know, that the non-voters for that matter. And most of those are youths. Thank you.
This is what happens when we still teach about Captain Cook and Abel Tasman discovering the Pacific and our islands. You don't learn about these issues at primary and high school. That's the first issue. That's why you don't know, because it's only when if you're fortunate to come to USP. That's one. Secondly, our social media is focused on other things. You know, we talk about Black Lives Matter, but we're not talking about West Papuan lives, we're not talking about Kanak lives, we're not talking about Maui lives. That's something we need to consider. As young people, what feeds are you getting? So the language also comes into play here. For the Pacific Conference of Churches, as I've shared, we support the work that our member church is doing in Kanaki. And the key issue for us that we are supporting in this process is actually looking beyond the elections and the question of nation building. And that is in regards to working with young people to develop a common understanding of nationhood, what it means to be a person that is, for whom Kanaki or New Caledonia, whichever we want to call it, is their home. And so that's why I was referring to this concept of the human being, looking at common humanity. So we are supporting a program with our partner church, our member church there, which brings this conversation together, young people from the different ethnic groups, to have these conversations about common humanity. That's one of the starting points, because that also can be a very divisive issue when it comes to the elections, as we've heard.
Sandra, if I just can make another comment. In terms of sovereign competencies, because Padre has just mentioned that in terms of institutional building for Kanaks, this is another area that MSG is deeply working on in empowering Kanak youths through attachments in the various MSG member countries. And Rose is one of the outcome of this of that process. And also recently, before I left MSG, we had one of these Kanaki girls studying in France, coming to learn about governance and democracies in the region. She had a stint at the MSG secretary before she moved on to the French embassy in Suva. And I understand she's back in France now. Yeah, she's a Kanaki girl. So these programs being ongoing through the MSG process. And also, yes, Rose went to Papua New Guinea as well. Yes. This is something that is very important, but we need to do more of this. We need to do more of this. Thank you.
Can I just make a comment that I mentioned that by 2018, all parties in New Caledonia and the French state had agreed, somewhat belatedly, that Kanak youth had missed out in many of the developments and achievements under the Nemiro Accord, considerable achievements. And it has to be said that all committed themselves to addressing this issue. So I think that if any of the organizations, Pacific Island Forum, the MSG, the PCC wanted to benefit from that new determination of all parties to address this problem, there is funding available that the New Caledonian government is devoting to advancing the interests of Kanak youth. And the French state is doing the same, I believe. Perhaps the French ambassador's there, I'm not sure.
I think as Ambassador Yarvolia said, though, it needs some strategic leadership by regional organizations. You know, when I was young, 30 years ago, I worked with some groups to organize scholarships for about 30 New Caledonian students, Kanak students, to come to Australia to do their university studies in English. This was before the official Australian government scholarship program and France's Cadre Avenir program, which has been a significant feature of the Nemiro Accord, providing educational and professional training for many, many young people, not just Kanaks, but from the New Caledonian community. But that generation of Kanak students who came to Australia in the early 1990s to complete university studies not only got a university degree and improved their English, but also saw the world around them and broke out of a French mindset, which frankly is part of the colonial process, where people look to France for solutions. And one of the great strategic breakthrough, I think, has come over the last 20 or 30 years since the conflict of the 1980s, has been this notion that there are Pacific solutions to a lot of the issues that face the people in New Caledonia. And therefore strategic scholarship programs from PTC, Pacific Regional Seminary, the Fiji School of Medicine, USP, might I suggest, to get some Kanak students, not just to go to the University of New Caledonia in Namibia, but to come to USP, not just to get a university education, but to meet their counterparts from the Pacific, to build personal friendships and ties that will carry on into the future. I'm going to embarrass Madame Wete by saying that she was a young girl in Melbourne, she was a young girl in Suva, and has come on to represent her country now as effectively a delegate, an ambassador for her country. So those ties linger on in the decades to come, whether New Caledonia is independent or not. That sort of strategic links, planting the seeds today for the future, is important for young people. And I think institutions have a responsibility to think strategically about the scholarships, the internships, the training programs, and so on, that would facilitate that personal process. Yeah, because I think it's really important. And some of the next generation of leaders coming up in New Caledonia are often people who've not just traveled to France for education, training, enjoyment, but are looking to the neighboring countries around them.
Thank you, Nick. Well, certainly at USP, I think we need to do more work on that. There's a question on the floor there. Yeah.
Good afternoon. My name is Aurélie Cochard, and I teach linguistics here. I'm very glad Pastor James Bhagwan touched upon the role of social media. My question is about communication and representation, because I'm curious to know the views of the panelists on the role of the social media, because I think we are more and more aware than that across the world, when there are electoral campaign or political events that have such a decisive impact for some territories and their relationship internationally, we can see how the social media can have a crucial role in changing people's behavior and opinions. And so I had kind of two questions, and the impact as well on the polarization of societies. So I had two questions. One is there any either research or maybe experience on the role of the social media in particular on the first and maybe the second, the campaign of the first and second referendum? And the second question is for regional partners or regional actors and maybe international actors. If we are so worried about how fair the referendum is set by France, which is a very legitimate question, totally, are we now looking at the role of the social media, which is beyond the control of one nation, isn't it, to actually really make this referendum happen in a fair way? Because I'm not sure how fair they play, and they have a big influence on the youth and not just the youth. So thank you.
I have a pulpit, so I don't have to worry about social media. No, but I live stream sermons. No, but this is a serious question. We have seen, I mean, we just look, there are not just, we have the referendum happening in a few weeks here, but there are also elections happening in other countries, and you can see the role of social media in that. I don't know if there's been any research. I'm not aware of any. Maybe the researchers that are at the back online can help us with that. But I just give you an example. If you look at something on, for example, for us, PCC, our focus is, one of our pillars is self-determination, hence our support and our work since 1960s with these issues. In terms of one of those areas that we're working on the issue of West Papua, you see a very strong social media, only increasing now as you start to see the use. Again, it's language tends to be the big thing. So because I don't speak as much French as I should, perhaps, I am not able to follow much of what's happening on social media when it comes to Kanaki, but we have a direct line with our member church. And, but we can see that happening as an important way of getting information out. The other side of that coin is that it's also can be unfiltered, or how is it filtered? Because that is the other concern of how social media can be manipulated. And we've seen in some of these cases in independence movements where the colonizing country throws in a lot of money. And technology now with algorithms and things like that, you cannot say that social media is a free area, free space. It's still very controlled and manipulated.
Sandra, could I add a brief comment on this? Because I think that social media is significant. I mean, I speak to you as someone speaking to you from some distance on Zoom. A lot of these discussions, particularly with the border closures that have come from coronavirus, have relied on social media. So as a technology, it's vitally important to get information out. There'll be very few, for example, foreign journalists going to report on this referendum. I spent 6 weeks in New Caledonia during the 2018 referendum, but can't travel there because of coronavirus restrictions at the moment. So new technologies play a vital role in getting information out and about. That's certainly true. Reverend Bhagwan is correct too that social media is a double-edged sword. In New Caledonia, there's quite a lot of racist abuse on social media and Facebook. Very popular, Facebook and other mediums, but it's also not purely for information, but can be used for partisan and, as I say, sometimes racist sledging of the other side. The independence movement in New Caledonia has relied a lot on social media to circumvent the control of mainstream media. The one daily newspaper in New Caledonia is owned by a local businessman, previously had a very strong anti-independence editorial policy. The French state-run media obviously have certain constraints on how they report. Local business houses give a lot of funding to commercial radio stations that are opposed to independence, and the one surviving pro-independence radio station, Radio Jiddu, is very poor. So social media has allowed a liberation of ideas to spread. One little anecdote I think that's really important, though, is that that information provides connections across Melanesia particularly, but across the Pacific in ways that just didn't exist 20 or 30 years ago. When I was reporting in 2018, I was putting stuff up on Facebook, photos, links to interviews and so on, and got flooded with links from West Papua, where people there who have a great interest in the issue of self-determination and were very interested to find out what was happening with the Kanak struggle and what relevance it had for their struggle against Indonesia, were seizing upon anything coming out on social media from New Caledonia. And I think that's significant that this technology, despite its flaws, despite its control by major corporations, does allow people to make the effort to connect in ways that, you know, in the 20th century were just impossible.
Thank you, Nick. I think the next question is that Ambassador Bagari? Did you want? Yep, you have the floor. So, and then up the back.
Thank you, Joey.
We have one first here and then at the back. Thank you.
I think my voice is loud enough, but I'll use the mic anyway. All right, we've got people there online. Yes, I have two questions related in a way. One is on the forum position. Do we have a consensus or not on New Caledonia? I ask this question because the history of the forum, as we know, the forum came into being because of the Pacific Conference of Leaders on the one hand and the South Pacific Commission. And there were these layers of unequal participation of regional players or leaders. And so the forum started with something happening in Port Moresby. Ratu Sirkamasesemara was the, for want of a better word, the instigator of this movement for leaders to come together. So right now, with the latest development of unequal partners, again, this is a wrong choice of word, I think, but within the forum membership, we have independent countries and we have territories. So what is the forum position in terms of seeing all of us becoming equal if we have an architecture that is constructed in that manner? That's the first question.
Did you want to add the second one now, or?
Yeah, I might as well do this. And this is to MSG. The MSG appears to have a conflict of interest here in terms of allowing, and I'm speaking frankly, and I'm a member of the MSG. So again, I think this is not my position. This is an intellectual, I hope, but university academic discussion going on here. The self-determination of West Papua, taken together with self-determination in New Caledonia. The membership of Indonesia appears to be at odds with the goal of MSG, the initial raison d'etre of MSG. How do you see that as former Director General of the MSG? Thank you. That's my question.
Hand over to Dame Meg first and then to...
Very important question that High Commissioner Bogari has asked about the construct of the Pacific Island Forum as it is now. I mean, the early history from my reading is that it began as a discussion between Samoa and Tonga, really looking at how to trade and get better prices for bananas with New Zealand. That was one of the aspects of Ratu Mara's book, and then Fiji came into it as well. And then much later, and sometimes when you link in for Pacific Island Forum, it says that it was initiated by New Zealand in 1971. That's not true. The history of it comes from the Pacific. The meeting was in New Zealand in 71, but the concept of the Pacific being together was initiated within the region itself. And early participation was also of countries that were not self-governing, like the Cook Islands, but part of those early discussions in terms of forming the South Pacific Forum. So yes, we have three layers actually. We have in the independent states, we have self-governing, and we have the territories. And the territories were the ones, French Polynesia and New Caledonia were admitted in 2016 in Ponape. That was very much led by member states who wanted a much more inclusive approach to all countries within the region. One could dissect all that and have a discussion with regard to what that means for the region, and Mick has touched on this, and so has Denise, with regard to how this all plays out when it comes to the geopolitics. And I think that's a conversation that the Pacific really needs to have. However, you asked what their position is on self-determination, and the self-determination issue is left to for New Caledonia and French Polynesia for them to make that decision. It's not as if I don't believe that there's been a statement, unless Alfred can correct me. There's not been a statement saying that you have to be independent to be a member. But the role of the forum as an observer to these referendums in New Caledonia is to assure that the processes are fair and transparent. But most of all, what we found when we visited there is that the people, particularly the Kanak people, have come to us and thanked us for being there. It gives them an assurance that there is an interest from the Pacific. And I'm sure it's the same for MSG, and we link up when we're there, that should give them assurance that we are watching. But the decision in the end is the decision of people in New Caledonia and French Polynesia. But I think it's the effort that's been put in to have New Caledonia and French Polynesia re-registered on the Committee of 24 is really, it's in the doing is the telling, rather than the statements that have been made. But I'm going to check with my political advisor over here, because I may have, am I correct there? Thank you.
Thank you. Alfred is nodding, Meg, don't worry. Thank you for that question, High Commissioner Bogari. And in terms of your question of conflict of interest, from my perspective, I don't see a conflict of interest. As I said earlier in my presentation, if you listen to what I said earlier, the New Caledonia referendum issue has a mandate of leaders, which means all leaders agreed to that. Whereas the West Papua issue does not command the consensus of all leaders. You know, Papua New Guinea and Fiji, they are not agreeing to certain issues. And that led, to the fact that there is no consensus at the leaders level, so that they can provide appropriate mandate to the Secretariat to run with it. What Indonesia was invited. My information that I'm aware of is that in the leaders meeting, MSG leaders meeting in Solomon Islands in Honiara, they admitted the Republic of Indonesia as associate member to represent the five Melanesian provinces of Indonesia, the eastern provinces of Indonesia, into the MSG. And you yourself knows the mechanics of this, and that is how the game has been played all along. One is a clear mandate. The FLNKS has a very, very clear mandate for MSG to undertake, and that's why it's full throttle from global to regional to national. The other one, we don't have a mandate for that. Maybe one day. Thank you.
We have time for maybe two more questions. So one at the back. Yep. And Beth.
Thank you very much. Joe here from Pang. Maybe today Meg and Nick, who has been reporting on the issue, very much focused on the ongoing post-Cotonou agreements. As the EU seeks to redefine or rather review its political and economic relations with the Pacific, do you see the current overseas countries and territories under the EU as crucial assets to the current ongoing negotiations? And on the same issue of the post-Cotonou agreements, what does it mean for regionalism when you have France sitting at the same table with our Pacific Island leaders negotiating such a deal? Vinaka.
My understanding is that France doesn't sit at the table because the overseas territories are not part of the negotiations in the post-Cotonou. It doesn't. Sorry, giving me a. It's okay. It's true. I mean, this was an issue in the discussions amongst our own leaders at a time when I think the EU wanted to bring the OCTs, the territories, much closer to the negotiations on post-Cotonou, and that was very clearly stated by our leaders that they were not to be part of it. Now, what does that mean? Is that I mean, the negotiations itself for us. The focus will be very much on the, sorry, you know what the negotiations have been, the issues, but there's still no commitment in terms of what is going to be the financial support to get all this to happen. And I think the ACP, or the Organization of the African, Caribbean and Pacific States, now see their remit to be much wider than just limited to Europe. And I think this is going to be the exciting part of all this, is once post-Cotonou is negotiated, is where does the OACP stand? It shouldn't be just limited to Europe. It should be a body that goes much further than that in terms of our relationships with Asia, relationships with North America, etc. So, I mean, once post-Cotonou is completed, I think there'll be more exciting channels of engagement by those countries right across the globe.
Okay, I think Beth, you want to have the last question?
Thank you. Elizabeth Holland at the University of the South Pacific. I found myself alarmed by the discussion of the manipulation of social media, because my perhaps overly dramatic brain leapt forward to question so I can see that France and Australia and our European partners and others would have an interest in the manipulation, but so may also Morocco in its fight for the annexation of the Western Sahara, so may Taiwan, so may Russia, so may China, so may others. And given the history of that sort of manipulation, or North Korea, the interest in destabilizing democracies is profound by some actors in our geopolitical space. And sometimes we as Pacific diplomats can underestimate our influence and our voice. And it just made me alarmed to make those connections for myself. And I wonder whether or not that my alarm has any resonance with our panel members.
Anyone want to take that up?
If I could maybe make a quick comment on that. I think it's important to remember that New Caledonia is, in its essence, a Pacific nation. And politically, the debate about self-determination, about sovereignty is part of that. But there are strong cultural, customary, and personal links amongst players in New Caledonia. Even in the worst of times, the personal connections between supporters and opponents of independence at a political level are still strong. And, you know, the famous handshake of Jean-Marie Tjibaou and Jacques Lafleur symbolized that at moments after tension, people can come together in a Pacific way. And as an outsider to New Caledonia, but who's been visiting for 40 odd years, you know, you can build relationships. And as an Australian journalist who's been critical of French colonialism, I still have good relationships with people on all sides simply by turning up and talking and engaging. And I think that we shouldn't overemphasize the social media stuff, that New Caledonia, as a country of 270,000 people, still relies on those personal bonds, Pacific bonds, cultural bonds. And you see that today where there is an islander and a Pacific majority in the Congress. The three members of the Éveil Océanien, the Wallisian party, have joined the pro-independence bloc. They're not supporters of independence, but they work together on issues of common concern. So I think one of the strengths and resilience of New Caledonia that has allowed it to transcend really horrible times like the 1980s has been that sense of building a common nation. I personally think that the region should do more to support that process. But I'm always heartened by that, the Pacific values of respect, of family, of hospitality, of Christianity, and others that unite people are still there. And despite the worst of times, that's that I think can transcend the sort of misinformation. People will watch it, but they won't necessarily believe it.
I think, yeah, what he said. But just 2 points here. I think one is your alarm is important because it also underpins the need for us to pay attention to the geopolitical situation as we're dealing with issues like this in terms of self-determination, but also in the context of climate change. The other issues around, you know, human security, around economics, etc. And that's a need for our emerging generation, our young people, to be woke, as they use the term, not just to issues happening in one part of the planet, but really to what's happening on a global scale and trying to understand that. That's one. The second is social media, as Nick said earlier, is not only what we post on Facebook, the public post, but the ability to use social media to connect people, Messenger, Viber, and all the other smaller interpersonal uses of social media are very important for creating communication networks. And I think that's a very important value for it. Naka.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, Rose, for organizing these discussions, and thank you, the panelists. I have 2 questions that I wanted to ask. I've studied in New Caledonia, and I would say I became like home to me. But just in terms of this 1998 Nouméa Accord, they gave the New Caledonian like students to go and study in France, develop the capacity to come back and serve back in the system. However, when I was there, it seems that this 400 cards that have been sent to France, when they come back home, they don't have jobs. And I think, Dennis, you mentioned the fact that the administration is actually overflooded by French metropolitans. So what, I mean, in terms of the panelist view, is it a strategic or tactics that France used during the last 20 years to say, okay, by the way, 2018, you don't have the capacity, so remain as French territory, or 2020, you will depend on us because you don't establish this all administrations or institutions in place. That's the first point. The second point I think I wanted to ask Ambassador Amena, with respect to if New Caledonia is going for independence on the 4th of October and then comes next year, what will be the stand, or I would say the support that MSG or even the forum will help in terms of building these nations? Because that links to my first questions. Because judiciary, we might, maybe Rose might correct me, but maybe one or two judges who are Kanaks, educations or others. So those are my point. Thank you.
Who would like to take the first question? Nick? Denise?
I could make a comment there. The 400 cadre program was entered into, I think, by all parties, the independence leaders and the loyalist parties and the government of France, in good faith. Over the years, though, it has to be said that it just hasn't worked. I've done a lot of research to look at the numbers, and you're absolutely right. People come back from France that are young Kanaks and have not been able, you do not see the large numbers of Kanaks in the administrative areas. That being said, the creation of provinces, 3 provinces, 2 of which are in the Kanak areas, which you do have, the Kanak provinces are run by Kanak politicians and Kanak senior people. But sadly, the administrative structures under them is still largely peopled by French public servants, non-Kanak public servants. You can, part of the problem is systemic, that you go right back to the way in which the French education system, and let's not have no bones about it, the system in New Caledonia is French. It's the same education system that applies in any part of France. And there comes a point when you've got people who are young people from Kanak areas have to go to major areas to have education. They're not in their home environments. There are certain points, important points in the French education system where, sadly, a number of Kanaks just do no longer continue. So there is a systemic issue. For all of the successes, and people can reel off, and I could say something, I could name some senior bureaucrats and some senior lawyers, 1 or 2. But 30 years later, it's not enough. There's obviously been a failure there. And this is why, even though it was at the 11th hour in 2018, I thought it was highly significant that all parties, the state of France, and the different political leaders were getting together and all publicly acknowledging that there had been a failure. So at least that's where things start. And let's not forget, we've got major discussions to take place about where New Caledonia is going, regardless of the outcome of these polls. So I think we have to have faith. And if we can have support from the region, all of us, Australia, New Zealand, the region, in this post-vote event, then that would make a difference, I think.
Thank you for the second question. As I've mentioned earlier, the sovereign competencies initiatives that the FLNKS have developed, supported by the MSG Secretariat and other institutions, as well as our MSG memberships, is an initiative to build capacities should you know, New Caledonia becomes independent under under Kanaki rule. That is the initiative. As I mentioned earlier, that we are encouraging their attachments and learning experience in our member countries, Vanuatu in particular, where they speak French, and also in other countries like Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and other countries in the region. Because we have the information that the Kanaks are facing the same issue that our Northern Pacific brothers are facing. They go to the US mainland, only a few of them returned. Most of them got stuck there, in the US mainland. It's the same with the Kanaks. The other extreme is the equity issue in terms of scholarships. Most are given to French or what, and the Kanaks, there's limited scholarships until recently when there was an intervention done by the FLNKS. So this is an ongoing issue, and we would like to encourage, other regional partners here, like USP, if you can step in and work in conjunction with the FLNKS, with the MSG, with our Pacific Island brothers, to assist them. I've heard it from them in various interactions that should they take over a new country arises tomorrow morning, are they in a position to run it? That is the big question that they're facing. And also a big issue that we have to strategically place ourselves into, of all players here, to assist the Kanaks and New Caledonia moving forward. I hope I answered the question. Thank you.
Could I just add quickly, there are also some really vital things that New Caledonia can bring to the region. One of the huge successes of the Nemiro Accord was the so-called economic rebalancing, where in the Northern Province, Kanak dominated, the Northern Province has invested in nickel smelter, working with transnational corporations, but with 51% control of a joint venture. That's unprecedented in the Pacific for a regional resource project. And I think there are some really interesting lessons that come out of the experience of transforming the nickel industry, this major resource industry, that would benefit other neighboring countries. Similarly, the role of women, including Kanak women, in governance, local mayors, provincial assemblies, and indeed the Congress of New Caledonia. Under the electoral law system, nearly half the candidates are women. And, New Caledonia was the first country in the region to have a female president and vice president at the same time in 2004. So the role of women in governance at all levels of government, the experience of Kanak women in New Caledonia, I think has a lot to share with fellow women across Melanesia. So I think it's not simply us bringing solidarity to New Caledonia. I think there are things we can draw from the experience of the Kanak struggle over the last 30 years, 40 years, that would benefit neighboring countries as we debate these global challenges, how to respond to dealing with transnational corporations over resource exploitation. How do we deal with China? How do we deal with the pandemic of violence against women? New Caledonia brings a lot to the regional table as we struggle with these common problems.
Thank you, Nick. We'll take one last question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me this last question. Albon Nisho, the Marshall Islands ambassador to Fiji and Pacific Islands Forum permanent rep. Just a few points I wanna make, and perhaps a question to the panelists. But let me first thank the university and the organizers and the panelists for allowing this platform of discourse to happen. We realize that our struggles are not unique to ourselves. When we have these kind of conversations and see similarities in other countries, particularly my own country's struggle for independence. But one thing struck me because I joined another seminar by a young Pacific researcher last week on Pacific diplomacy in West Papua. And one thing that one of my colleagues mentioned, which stuck on me, was that Pacific diplomacy is heavily relied on people diplomacy. not so much political interest, but more on people diplomacy. And this rings true when I look back to the 2016 leaders retreat to grant full membership to New Caledonia and French Polynesia, because I asked my representative who attended that meeting on our behalf why they decided to allow that. And they said, you cannot, how do we turn our backs on our brothers and sisters from this region? And I think that questions become, or that statement or that state of mind becomes more important as the young student from Tonga raised the role of regional organizations and what we are doing to help provide these platforms for these conversations for our young and future leaders to understand and participate in. But particularly the university's role as being the center for these type of discourse to happen. To our understanding, young people have been particularly the force that sort of transcends political boundaries to raise these issues, whether they're the nuclear issues of the Pacific or the independent Pacific movement across the region. And I'm glad that certain aspects of languages were also drawn to the conversation, whether they be traditional languages or our colonialist languages. But there are also emerging languages that I think we have come to sort of accept. Contemporary languages, social media becomes one of those. TikTok becomes another social media tool that transcends these conversations. So I just wanted to put those points out there, but I have one specific question because it was raised a number of times throughout the discussion, particularly by Ms. Denise Fisher and Nick, on the Indo-Pacific Strategy. That becomes another colonial tool, I feel, to sort of grab us into this long-standing struggle that, quite frankly, does not really interest us, but it does threaten us. It does have a lot of conversation. It allows for conversation to happen around these specific strategies that are being drawn up in Paris, in Washington, now in New Delhi, in Canberra. Important conversation with partners, but I just wanted to get the views from the panelists on how these affect the continuous struggle for independence from Pacific people.
Thank you. It's probably an appropriate question to end on. So I'll hand it over to the panelists who would like to comment on that. Okay, James?
Yes, been having this conversation more and more in different circles, I think. And I think firstly, that's important. It shows that we are being a little bit more discerning rather than accepting. I think, some of us are still trying to address the issue of Asia Pacific, and now we've got Indo-Pacific. I think, well, I'll put it this way. In one sense, this is important for us to be aware of. And we have the conversations, but our Pacific Island countries, while engaging in understanding, should not subscribe to it, because I think it threatens our regional work. And that's an important thing for us to remember. We've got to put our Pacific first. The second is, I'm always wondered, these are all security-related conversations. Trade, yes, but always based around security. And then it's whose interests. It's never our interests first. So how do we protect our interests? How do we speak to that? And the other side of it, just recently, last month, we reached in the climate, in the environmental space, Earth Overshoot Day. And that is when we reached that point on the calendar where we used up all the renewable resources for the Earth for that particular year. And in an explanation around it, we were all lumped into the Asia-Pacific footprint on the Earth. And I made the comment that The Pacific isn't even one small toe on that footprint, yet we bear the brunt of it. And so that's really important. In the context of self-determination, we've got to make our stand. And while we recognize these things are happening, we've got to, this is a challenge for us even more so, to work on our regional relationships.
Thank you, Alban, for that difficult question. I'll speak from the perspective of Fiji. Fiji is very strong in its bilateral relations with Australia. As you know, the recent Wuvala partnership that the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister of Australia entered into, believing in the fact that the bilateral relationship strengthens the values, whether you're talking about security, alliances, or defenses, is something that that Fiji is currently embarking upon. The Indo-Pacific strategy, I believe, is something that we need more conversations on it, to have a better understanding on it. And below this Indo-Pacific partnership strategy, there are other issues happening in the region, which for some of us are aware of, that, you know, that sort of sums up to the global level on such big initiatives, Indo-Pacific strategy. I believe that sovereign states should be very strong in the determinant of the opposition on how to tackle or how to deal with this and assess positions better, to see that we unnecessarily commit something ourselves into that may not augur well with our development aspirations as we go forward. Thank you.
So the geopolitical issues in the Pacific is something I think about a lot. And particularly now that the 2050 strategy for the Pacific, as the leaders have asked us to work on it, and we've had consultations here with students at USB. Every country is having consultations within the Secretariat, and hopefully with the Pacific Council of Churches and the Theological College will have them as well, because of the thinking that they've been doing. So what is it that we want for ourselves by 2050? Secondly, over the last week, we've had a really incredible conversation with experts on climate change and sea level, maritime boundaries and sea level rise, and what that means in terms of securing our boundaries, and what does those legal implications for us. And we talk about the Blue Pacific, and then what the linkage of the Blue Pacific is as our identity as peoples, and the Blue Pacific continent as our region. So you have the Indo-Pacific strategy. Yeah? So the first time I really was faced with this, although the language had been around for a long time, was when we went to the Palm meeting in Japan, and it was used constantly there, and many of us in the Pacific asking each other, what does that really mean for us? When you have an alliance of countries, the United States, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, India. India's warmed up more recently since the clash with China on the boundaries between the Indo-Sino border. Then, of course, we have our relationships as independent states and as a region with those countries. But we also have very strong relationships with China. And we have strong relationships with Taiwan, some of our countries more closely than others. In the Pacific, when it comes to how we deal with China and Taiwan, our leaders have an agreement in the 1992 agreement, and in respectful Pacific way, acknowledge that each country chooses who its relationship will be with, either with China or with Taiwan. And no country dictates to the other what that should be. And that is a very, it's a path that the Secretariat has to deal with when we get support from Taiwan and support from China, and how we have those conversations. then now with the reemergence, I would say, of the United States, particularly in the Southern Pacific, where the Northern Pacific has got a political relationship and has had the compact arrangements. And now we have allowed a voice in the region. Also, just recently, we understand that there will be legislation in the US Congress called the Blue Pacific Act, and they want to have discussions with staff with us from the Pacific Island Forum about Secretariat, what this will all mean and how this will be rolled out. But in our own neighborhood, where France also is very much a part of, I don't think it's, I could be wrong in this, somebody correct me. I don't always see France's name on the Indo-Pacific Alliance, but the attachment or the diplomatic alliances are there. And when I hear Denise say that there was this, you know, on a battleship where the French and the Australians moving forward, in terms of the defense arrangements, I get anxious, I mean, a bit nervous about all that, because I think what we're leaning towards is alliances that are carving out the Pacific, and we're not part of the conversation. And this happens in so many instances that it's as if we are oblivious to the existence of bigger powers, and that the seaways are there for the vessels for their own interests without any serious consequences or discussions, particularly, I should say, with the leadership of the Northern Pacific, people in the Central Pacific, Western Pacific, and to the east. All this is really important. This is control of a large part of the world and its resources. And we might be small in population, but we have large EEZs, and getting that secured is so vital. And all this plays out in terms of alliances and the strategic interests of superpowers and how they see us in this region, where naval bases may be built, where we are all educated, what languages we speak, what resources we have, how they are fished, etc., etc., etc. And I think in this university, in all universities across the Pacific, we better start waking up as to a time in our lives, and the time in your lives and in your children's lives that is going to be very different from what it is now. And New Caledonia and its self-determination is really important, because where are they going to fit into this picture of a united, of a Pacific, of the Blue Pacific, and of an ocean, of the Blue Pacific continent? And who is it? Is it the Kanak people? Is it the citizens of New Caledonia that the Pacific deals with? Or are they metropolitan powers that we deal with? These are questions that have to be answered by the Pacific Island Forum, as it does by every citizen in this region. Thank you.
I'll just give Nick and Denise a moment to give a quick response.
I think very quickly I'd just say two things. When people talk about Indo-Pacific security, the obvious question is security for whom? And, you know, as an Australian citizen, I'm very conscious that the strategic partnership between Australia and France largely ignores public discussion of the right to self-determination for people in the region. And as a citizen of the region, I despair that here we are coming into the third decade of the 21st century, and we're still talking about colonialism. And so I think that discussion, you know, the forum took the lead with the Boy Declaration to begin a conversation about broadening the definition of security. Obviously, it says that climate change is the greatest single threat to the well-being, security, and livelihoods of Pacific peoples. And obviously, the partnerships that we're talking about with all these geopolitical players, whether as citizens or as government, the question is, what do they bring to that full spectrum of security issues, not just the traditional state-centered security, the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific, but what do they bring to address the greatest single threat of climate change? What do they bring to the table to address the pandemic of violence against women in the Pacific, to the environmental and social challenges that are at the heart of ordinary people's definition of security? So I don't like the Indo-Pacific construct because I think it privileges that global view of the region rather than a view that respects the histories, the cultures, the identities of the people of this area. I think that's a challenge because certainly in my country, in Australia, the dominant discourse largely ignores what's happening in New Caledonia and in other places. The people of Guam face the same struggle, with the Chamorro people, a minority in their own country, a third of the land area being taken up for military bases at a time of the growing US-China tensions. What voice do the Chamorro people have in this discussion about Indo-Pacific security? And I, as a citizen, rather than as a government representative, I always come back to those core concerns. What does it mean for people on the ground?
Thank you, Denise.
Yeah, just briefly, because I realise we're running out of time, I'd like to come back to what one Kanat leader said after Mr. Macron left New Caledonia, having spoken about this Indo-Pacific vision, which Nemiro could have if it decided to vote to stay with France. He said, and it was publicised in the One newspaper, that, yeah, Indo-Pacific doesn't matter to us. We are already in the Indo-Pacific. And that's a reference, isn't it, to France only being a member of the claiming membership of the Indo-Pacific because of its overseas territories in the Indian and Pacific Oceans physically. That brings us back to what the Kanat Leaguers want to achieve. And it brings us back to the self-determination process that's currently underway. And I would take a slightly different position to Nick in the sense that I feel that my country, Australia, supports the Nemiro Accord and the agreements that have been hard won over these decades, and that we are watching. We too, like other Pacific Island Forum countries, we all want a full and respectful implementation of the commitments made by the larger power and by all the political groups in New Caledonia. And we're watching, and then let us watch this process unfold and see what the people of New Caledonia want for themselves. Finally, on the question of Pacific Island Forum and island countries' positions on the Indo-Pacific, isn't it a question of being very certain about your interests, what your interests are? And as I hope I explained in my little presentation earlier, I have huge respect for the capacity, it's proven, of the Pacific Island states to stand up for their interests and to shape the policies, and succeed in doing so, of a foreign power in this region so that it does work within the Pacific way. And I congratulate the Pacific Island people for that, and I hope that you will continue to see a role for yourselves in shaping what happens in this region in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. I'm going to now hand over to Rose Wete from the New Caledonian government to give the vote of thanks and closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Bonsoir. Thank you, Dr. Sandra Tat. As we conclude this evening's event, I would like to extend a big oleti, merci beaucoup, vinaka vakalevu, to our esteemed panelists for availing yourselves to be with us this afternoon. Your contribution towards this important regional discussion is important and much appreciated. To all our distinguished guests and excellencies, government officials, colleagues of the Diplomatic Corps, and to the student staff of the university and friends who are joining us this evening, thank you for your time and your presence. This week, I am truly honored to share that New Caledonia is on the agenda in Fiji and in the region, not only to discuss the role of regional and sub-regional actors in this important referendum, but also an opportunity through our award-winning films to share New Caledonia's unique history, diverse cultures, and peoples. I would like to take this opportunity to promote the first edition of New Caledonia Film Festival, which will happen here at the university on Wednesday, the 23rd of September at the USB Performance Space from 6 p.m. to 8:30. This year, we are showcasing our award-winning short films from New Caledonia, and it is my great pleasure to be bringing that to share with you all. It is open to the public, and refreshments, of course, in our Pacific manner, will be provided. So please come early to secure your seats and to enjoy the food and the company, and especially to have a view of New Caledonia's culture and to celebrate New Caledonia. A separate viewing will also take place, but that will be on Thursday at the Demoda Cinemas. To conclude, may I also take this opportunity to extend my deep appreciation and merci beaucoup to Dr. Mila Vaha and Dr. Sandra Tat for organizing and facilitating this panel discussion. A special thanks as well to dear friend Nick and Denise, who have both been, I would say, part of my journey to where I am today, and I'm especially honored and happy that you are both here with us this evening. So now I would like to extend a warm invitation to you all to join us for light refreshments, which will be served right next door. And once again, big vinaka vakalevu. Merci beaucoup. Ole tiacha huach.